What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. Alright, so before I get into this video, I want to give a big shout out to the brother Brendan Olson for the donation to the channel via the Cash App. Much respect to him for showing love. Once again, long-time subscriber, big-time supporter of my platforms, Too Raw for TV, Too Raw Media, Too Raw for Sports, and the Patreon and Rumble. Alright, so this is going to be somewhat of a controversial video, and I'm only playing devil's advocate here because there have been some critics of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's career. Now, I think when you make the exclamation that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is the greatest basketball player of all time, I think he has a tremendous case for that. All right? When you incorporate high school, college, and the pros, I think he has a better case than anybody as the greatest basketball player. Now, if you mean the greatest professional basketball player of all time or NBA player, he's usually in the conversation. But there are some holes there. There are some things you can point out that could justify taking Kareem Abdul-Jabbar out of the top three. And what are these things? Well, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, as great as he was, and as effective as he was, because he went up against more NBA talent than anybody else in history, went up against more Hall of Fame centers than anybody in NBA history. But there was some weaknesses that he had. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was more of a finesse player. Came into the NBA 7'2", 225 pounds, although he did eventually bulk up to 250, 265 toward the end of his career, but he still always maintained a rather slender build for the most part. But he struggled against certain players. He struggled, for instance, against Moses Malone, especially in the playoffs. We all know how one-sided that 1983 NBA Finals was when he went up against Moses Malone. Kareem had these great numbers, but Moses Malone completely destroyed him. I believe he out-rebounded him in that four-game series 72-30. Now that's not just was an isolated series. It was in general. Whenever Moses Malone went up against Kareem, more often than not, he destroyed him. And this is interesting and significant because Moses is not considered a top 10 all-time player, more around top 15, top 20. And he's not considered top 5 as a center, usually in the top 10. He also struggled against Artis Gilmore to the point where sometimes whenever they were going up against one another, like in practice or anything, let's say that for instance, the Spurs were in town and they wanted to use the Lakers facilities and Kareem and them were whatever. Kareem did not like physicality. He didn't like it. Matter of fact, many times against Artis Gilmore, he would quit. That's been documented. I'm not talking about in the game. I mean in scrimmages or in practice, whenever he was against, teamed up against a guy like Gilmore, who was very, very strong. Arguably the top 2 or 3 strongest players in NBA history are Gilmore. Another thing that you could bring up about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is that in his peak years, in the early to mid 1970s, many of the great NBA players migrated over to the ABA. Artis Gilmore is one of them. Or they got their start in the NBA. In the ABA. So, like I said, Artis Gilmore is one of them. Julius Erving is another one. Rick Barry is another one. George Gervin is another one. Um, uh, David Thompson. Imagine if David Thompson that came over to the NBA rather than starting the ABA. Zelmo Beatty went over to the ABA. Mel Daniels. So many different guys. They all went over to the ABA or got their start in the ABA. So it wasn't the most talented NBA. It was talented. I've always maintained that. But it would have been even more talented had the ABA not existed. So he didn't go up against certain players. So when he won his 6 MVPs, 4 of them came when the ABA was in existence. One of those seasons when Kareem won the MVP, the Lakers had a losing record of 40-42. Some maintained that maybe it should have went to another player. I think that was 75-76. Unlike Wilt Chamberlain, who led the league in rebounding 11 out of 14 years, and would have been 12 out of 14 years, more than likely, had he not suffered that, what would have been a career-ending injury for anybody else, 1969-1970. Kareem only led the league in rebounding once, which was the 75-76 season. And then, starting in 1980, Kareem's rebounding fell off a cliff, often only averaging between 7 to 8 rebounds, maybe 9 rebounds a game. Also, despite having won 6 NBA championships, Kareem won Finals MVP only twice, 1971 and 1985. Although the last time he won it, he became the oldest player ever to win Finals MVP. The Lakers were not winning championships. They were getting to the playoffs, but the addition of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was not enough to push them to the NBA Finals. But they did not become a dynasty until the addition of Magic Johnson. And oftentimes in the Showtime era, especially after 1984-85, the best player on that team was Magic Johnson. That was highlighted by the fact that he won Finals MVP in 87, and Magic also was the league MVP in 87 and 89 and 90. It also can be pointed out that Kareem only won a championship when Oscar Robertson was added to the roster. When Oscar Robertson was added to the roster in 1970, they instantly won a championship, and they came close to winning a second championship, Robertson's last year. But after Robertson left, the Milwaukee Bucks fell off a cliff. Just to make a point of reference here, give me 1 second. The year they won a championship, they won 66-16. The next season, 63-19. The next season, 60-22. The next season, which was Oscar Robertson last year, when they went to the finals and narrowly lost to the Boston Celtics, 59-23. But then after that, 38-24. Now there are other factors involved, but now, this isn't to say that Kareem is not an all-time great center, but it's just a point of reference to make that maybe there are some things that we could look at as far as maybe you could, since we always penalize Wilt Chamberlain for not winning more championships, right? This reiterates my point about how it's important to have another great player playing alongside you, especially when you're a big man. When you look at all the great NBA championships, championship big men, they almost always had another great perimeter player. Now, King did win 2 championships without one singular great player, but still, he had a hell of a backcourt with Vernon Maxwell and Kenny Smith. That wasn't chopped liver. Those were 2 all-star, well, borderline all-star level players when they were playing at their highest potential. And then not only just that, when you look at the team around Hakeem, while there were no all-stars and whatnot, he did have a lot of talented players around him, very talented role players, to the point where if there was a role player Hall of Fame, many of those guys on his team, Vernon Maxwell, Kenny Smith, Mario Elie, Robert Horry, those guys would have been in the role player Hall of Fame. Oftentimes, Wilt didn't have that. He didn't have those high IQ role player type guys. Or if he did have some stars, they were like, Tom Gola, I believe, and, Paul Arizin. They were near the end of their careers. Guy Rogers was a really, really good pass first point guard, but he wasn't a dynamic player, like Bob Cousy. So if you get my point. But anyway, tell me what you guys think.